Hey, good day, and welcome back to another episode of the ADHD Dads. I'm your host, JJ.
And I am running close to fashionably late, but I'm your host, CJ.
And today we have a special guest, Dr. Carey Heller, on to discuss ADHD evaluations, executive dysfunction, and treatments and strategy. Dr. Carey Heller is a licensed psychologist and founding partner of Heller Psychology Group, located in Bethesda, Maryland. He specializes in the evaluation and treatment of attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or ADHD, executive function issues, learning disabilities, and related items, including anxiety. Dr. Heller, welcome to the ADHD Dads.
It's great to be here. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, man, we are really looking forward to this conversation, too. I was just telling you before we press record, our listeners know that I've been going along the ADHD evaluation, and that was one of actually our biggest episodes was talking about that process. And we'll probably be releasing my part two to that. With the official diagnosis and talking about that in the episode before you. So this will go really good together, and I think will be a really great benefit to our listeners and anyone else that's kind of going along that process with you. So thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Heller.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Happy to do it.
Yeah, one thing I'd just like to get to know a little bit about you before we dive into some of our questions, just to kind of get an understanding of what got you to where you are in pursuing psychology, and just what overall life looks like leading up to today.
Sure. I've actually been interested in being a psychologist since middle school.
Wow, okay.
My focus has changed a lot. My initial interest in the field had just been like seeing how terribly kids treat each other at the middle school age, bullying, things like that. Just got me interested in the idea of the field in the first place. And then, some internships and other stuff, got me interested in learning more about ADHD and other issues. And then, working so much with kids, ADHD is such a common issue, with kids, that just seeing sort of how much it manifests that, but also at the same time, it then obviously it doesn't just magically disappear in most cases, sort of when you get to become adulthood, contrary to what they used to think more. So I think, I also work with a fair amount with adults too, just because I think it's usually a lifelong thing that I think can be managed very well with the right supports, but you have to understand what are you dealing with in the first place. And then from there, targeting a variety of, strategy and different, interventions, formal and informal, in order to sort of to cope effectively and thrive in life.
That's interesting that you say that, because I think I had the adult ADHD versus the kids. I think when I first started kind of digesting a lot of this information, it does seem like an adolescent problem that's like, what happens to it once you grow up? Where does it go? Or what, you just learn these techniques to cope with it as you get older? Or where does the ADHD go? And now here I am, 36, and have just been diagnosed with ADHD, and it's like, well, where do I start? A lot of this seems like a lot of behavioral modification and therapy and tactics, and where do I do at 36? So that's interesting to hear. I'd like to dive into that a little bit more, but before we do, I want to ask, like, has this disorder manifested itself in your life in any way, in your personal life? Why ADHD specifically, and has that piqued your interest?
I don't know. Certainly I know a lot of people with it. I think I don't know. I think it's just in a lot of different ways. I think both personal as well as in, other circumstances as well. I feel like I think it's just something I've seen a lot of, and just, I find really interesting. And just because of the fact that I think in some ways, I think sometimes people discredit thinking, oh, it's not that big of a deal. It's, you can't focus. So what, you can cope. But, the reality is that it can, for some people, if it's severe enough and it's not treated, it's sort of life altering in terms of the ability to function in life and be successful and even just cope day to day. If you think about the executive function demands of, as an adult, having to take care of yourself, making sure eating, getting physical activity, even just the basics of paying bills, it can really be detrimental. And so I think just the fact that something that sometimes people discredit as being a big deal, I think is a huge deal if it's not addressed. But at the same time, people have the ability to thrive. But I think that people don't oftentimes realize how to do that. And sometimes the execution is a lot harder than knowing what to do.
Yeah. And so can you get into what ADHD is? How does this affect the brain? How does it show up on tests or in any sort of scientific method, or what's going on?
Sure. So, in like a very technical way, it's classified in the DSM-5-TR, which is the manual that clinicians use to have diagnoses for most mental health disorders. So in terms of ADHD, autism, anxiety, depression, it's the criteria that people use to make a diagnosis. it's considered a neurodevelopmental disorder. So the idea is that it's supposed to manifest in childhood in some way. I mean, even the idea is people certainly, as you've illustrated yourself, certainly can get diagnosed in adulthood with it. But the idea is that symptoms were supposed to have been present prior to age 12. And in a lot of cases, usually, like if someone's diagnosed as an adult, usually if you look back enough through the history, the signs are often there.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but the idea is basically it impacts essentially the idea of self-regulation. So the ability to regulate your attention, regulate your impulses. So the idea of doing things without thinking, and also hyperactivity. The idea of having a hard time sitting still, fidgeting, shaking your leg, fiddling with things. So there's sort of that piece of it. But then another thing that people don't realize a lot is that a lot of it also relates to this idea of needing stimulation. So a lot of people with ADHD sort of are kind of craving constant stimulation, and it's hard to sort of tolerate being bored. And so that's sort of another big piece of it. But basically, if you want to sort of simplify it, it's a disorder that impacts attention, focus, planning, organizing, task initiation, so kind of getting going with things, as well as sitting still and impulsivity. But again, not everyone has. There's so that the main types are there's predominantly an attentive presentation where the issues with attention are most prominent, and there could be some issues with hyperactivity and impulsivity, but they may not be as prominent, or at least they're not enough symptoms to warrant what's called the combined presentation diagnosis, which is where you have clinically significant issues with attention as well as hyperactivity and impulsivity. There's also a third kind, predominantly hyperactive/impulsive presentation, which that one, I mean, anecdotally, I don't see it as often as the others, but it is definitely is technically another type of ADHD.
So you had one of those you had mentioned can be a combined of ADD and ADHD.
Right. So technically, I mean, the way the criteria is set up, even if you don't have, so if you have what's called ADHD, predominantly an attentive presentation, where you don't have a lot of hyperactive or impulsive symptoms, it's still called ADHD. It's the specifier that determines if there's significant hyperactivity symptoms or not. But since I believe 1994 at least is when basically they got rid of it, calling it ADD. Like people anecdotally refer to it as that still, but the formal term for it is ADHD, even if you don't have the hyperactive piece.
Gotcha. Okay. Because when we were in the early stages of our evaluation process with our oldest, who's now 8, her pediatrician was writing down ADD, ADHD to kind of push it to the next evaluation process. And I was like, oh, I've never heard that it could be both, or how is that? But that clarification kind of helps along that process. So yeah, thank you.
I wanted to add something because this really struck my heart too. Is when you mentioned, way back in middle school, this interest in pursuing possibly psychology someday. I had been on the receiving end of some pretty extreme bullying, and that was a tough time in my life. And at the same time, I also very much had good relationships with certain people who reached out to me with their thoughts and feelings and stuff, and we just had good communication. So I always had an interest in having close, intimate relationships. And then now, as a father of a child who has ADHD, he's 7 years old now. I have had many times where I've heard he's had struggles at school, maybe it's on the playground or maybe in classroom or just with peers that he's trying to relate, but it's just difficult for him to stay focused, and his mind is constantly going. And the kids around him have even said directly to me sometimes, your son is annoying or something, and that brings me back to childhood and the pain that I experienced, and I'm trying to help my son, through his social world, but also, of course, just wanting to observe him and help him find his own space in that. So I definitely felt a little bit of an emotional response when you indicated your interest in this field, specifically because of some of the things that you experienced when you were younger. So yeah, that's one thing for me to kind of try and help my son now that he's been diagnosed, work through this. So we've pursued behavioral psychologists, and they're in demand right now. So we very much appreciate your time when we can get it.
Yeah, well, it's also hard because if you think about it, usually to work on stuff, the last thing you want kids to do is have to miss school to serve for appointments. And so, there's only so many hours after school, that people can have available anyway to see kids at a reasonable hour, which I think certainly contributes to it being hard sometimes to find people that have openings.
Yeah, and these evaluation processes are not short visits. I can tell you. I went through 4 3-hour visits myself, and my daughter's been through 2 4-hour visits. And we still have more evaluating to go. So, it
Yeah.
does take a strain to get that process, and I think that can deter a lot of parents too from going down that road, especially on top of like what you're kind of saying, like the stigma of especially I think in the 80s, 90s, this wasn't something that was like generalized in a way that it was in the zeitgeist so much as I feel we're getting there today. I know our parents' generation didn't kind of have the same openness to this disorder. It was coming out and being talked about, and the resources were kind of in lack there of, even if you did abide by this diagnosis. So for me, I went my whole life not knowing what was really going on internally or emotionally or psychologically, and I was parented with that kind of demeanor of just be quiet, go away, or calm down. And when I really started kind of learning about all this stuff in my adult life is when I started kind of having this connection to it of, wow, that's what's going on. Wow, I can relate to that. I can see what's going on here. And that makes sense. And that explains a lot. And with that knowledge, it really armed me to be more proactive, to understand the information that was coming at me and the resources that are out there and how to digest it all. And that's why I love having you on the show to kind of open people's minds to it and to talk about this stuff, because I think it can be very empowering to not only our kids but us as parents too, if we are willing to kind of look into that diagnosis ourselves. Because you said manifest in this behavior, but is ADHD a genetic thing? Is this something that we get from our parents and our bloodlines, or is this something that happens to kids at some point during their development?
It's a good question. I mean, there's definitely a genetic component in that, if you look at sort of families with ADHD, there's certainly, if you have one or both parents that have it, there's certainly a higher genetic likelihood that, a child's gonna have it. I mean, a lot of times, because you mentioned sort of, sounds like that you went through your own sort of evaluation and your child is, a lot of times I see it the other where basically the child goes through it first. The parents realize through that evaluation that they have a lot of similar issues, and then they do an evaluation themselves, realizing they have ADHD from their own kids' evaluation. So I think there's certainly I think it's more genetic thing. It's not something that, I mean, there's still research being done to sort of further examine all different causes, but it's not something like it's one of the big myths is that it was caused by bad parenting. That's not true. ADHD is not caused by bad parenting.
One thing that Colton, you're on mute. One thing that I wanted to kind of not necessarily contrast, but my experience with it is a little different than Colton's. That's I would like to bring up as well is that my son, we went and got him evaluated by a psychiatrist, and it was an hour-long interview with us parents and him, and then of course the psychiatrist. And then the next visit, we were talking about medication. So it was definitely a different type of evaluation process for us. And then Colton, you mentioned your upbringing and what kind of led you to today. For me, I remember some specific moments in my life where I was looked at by my parent and one of my siblings and kind of laughed at as I'm too sensitive. And that always stuck out at me because that hurt. It definitely felt like I wasn't, seen or heard in those moments. And now we come to today where we've had, leading up to the evaluation period, we had teachers saying, hey, there's some things going on with your son that we're noticing. And so we had a conversation with them for a little bit, and then we made that step to kind of taking the approach to getting him evaluated. And I guess my question to you, because Colton's perspective and his history here, and their oldest, and then my situation. Do you have like a recommendation for when people should consider seeking treatment or seeking an evaluation?
Sure. I mean, that's a good question. And, sort of another piece that probably makes sense for us to talk about is that, as you both have illustrated, there are different kinds of evaluations for ADHD. There's, going to a pediatrician and getting, sort of informal evaluation, maybe with filling out ratings forms and, the pediatrician making their own judgment. There's going to a psychiatrist for a clinical interview, and there's doing formal testing. Because there's not really one it's not like strep where you do a standard test and it's determined you have strep or you don't have strep. Or I guess, in recent times, COVID's probably, COVID test is probably a better example. But in terms of the question of like when should you seek an evaluation, I mean, anytime your child or you are struggling in some way, if it's not something that you feel like you're able to sort of address effectively yourself, and it's causing significant impact on your life or your child's life, I mean, there's often more sort of good, far more good that can come from sort of seeking consultation of some kind. I mean, rather than just sort of continue to try to keep doing the same thing and not having it work. So I mean, I think the bottom line, like a couple of things to look for would be if your child seems to have a hard time, paying attention in class, if they're getting easily distracted, if they can't seem to sit still. And again, for younger kids, it can sometimes be hard to piece that apart because naturally, especially boys, let's say 5 or 6 year old, it's not normal for them to be able to sit still for really long periods of time anyway. But the idea is like when in doubt, seeking some sort of consultation professional will help give you the peace of mind to determine, oh, this is something we should really explore further with a formal evaluation, or maybe it's age appropriate, let's monitor and keep an eye on things. But I think also there are a couple of time periods where I think the ADHD symptoms can come into play more. So for example, around third grade tends to be a time where there are increased executive function demands. So in terms of increased need to be independent, in terms of time management, organization. So that's one area in elementary school where I see oftentimes even if a child kind of got by when they were younger, it can become more of an issue. That the transition to middle school is another common time, as well as the transition to high school. And for other people, it can be college or even the second half of high school. There's sometimes big enough difference in the rigor that's expected that even if people were able to kind of keep it together when they're younger, they suddenly hit a wall, and these symptoms become sort of too much for them to sort of navigate effectively and still be thriving compared to what it was like before.
So what is why is the evaluation process different? I mean, how do we get someone like JJ that went to a psychiatrist one time and got a diagnosis like that to maybe get a more extensive evaluation? Or are there resources out there if you're just kind of hit a quick diagnosis like that you can maybe go seek out to get a more extensive evaluation? Or
I mean, it's hard. There's not one set way to get an ADHD evaluation, because based on the fact that it's like, for example, even with the formalized testing, it's not one measure that says I have ADHD or I don't. It's basically you look at all the measures together, which often include questionnaires to look at ADHD. There's a continuous performance test that's often used where looks at how well can someone stay focused in sort of a standardized way. And again, those in conjunction with looking at cognitive functioning, so looking at someone's processing speed, working memory, verbal abilities, making sure there's not any sort of underlying learning disability. You take all the information together to help basically determine is ADHD present, and also rule out anything else that could overlap. Because a lot of times, if you look at symptoms like anxiety, depression, along with ADHD, or even sometimes language processing issues, there can be a lot of overlap. And so if you just ask someone a couple of questions and don't look carefully at what's going on, you easily could miss ADHD or misdiagnose it. But I also think that each person's different. There are some situations where if there are very few other, possible comorbid issues that could arise, if it doesn't seem like there's any history of anything else, and really the main issues are core ADHD symptoms, presumably, I do think in general, I think for adults, I do think it's a little bit different than kids. Like, I think there's a little less at times that can be interfering in terms of an adult with ADHD, in terms of, doing more clinical interviews with formal testing. But, again, I think each person's different in terms of what the needs are. Because when it comes down to it, the question is, regardless of what kind of evaluation you do, what are you going to do with that information? So if the main thing is you want to know because you want to do medicine, then presumably if you go to a psychiatrist, you would essentially, I mean, obviously you want to make sure that's an accurate diagnosis, but if the main focus is getting medication, then, that probably is the most efficient way to do that. But at the same time, if let's say you want to get accommodations in school or other supports in place, oftentimes formal testing is required for that, depending on the school, unless the school will do the testing. But again, if your main focus is not medication at all, I mean, you could get a diagnosis from a psychiatrist, but the question really becomes, what are you going to do with that information? Because unless you're going to take the information that and use that to guide you in some way with treatment and other interventions, you're not really getting that much out of the diagnosis. other than, I mean, certainly I don't want to downplay, because certainly there's a lot to be said in terms of the how it feel, or the putting together with, I've had these difficulties, now I understand why. But in terms of the actual treatment piece, you want to figure out how are you going to execute this, take this knowledge and effectively apply it to maximize benefiting from knowing this information now.
And I think that you mentioned transitions. I think that's kind of one of the obvious signs of something's off, and my ADHD flares up. With the transition from high school to college, or from college to the professional career. There's a lot of difference between those environments, and that's oftentimes when we'll see some symptoms kind of be exhibited. My son, we moved across the country last year to a new school, new state, new everything. And immediately it was just like everything had blown up in our faces. Even though we had already been equipped with the medication, he was still experiencing that anxiety and stress of all the new. So even, regardless of what the medication was doing for some of his behavior, the environment was still enough for him to, exhibit all the other symptoms of his ADHD. So we've been looking for the next step, the next option for him, and behavioral psychology has been one of those options. So yeah, I think that's the question that I had, which you kind of answered too, is what are the right next steps for people when they have received a diagnosis?
Right, and again, it's going to depend on the person, but oftentimes, so if you're looking at medication, going to a psychiatrist to get medication is often one next step that can be really good. Again, it doesn't make sense necessarily for everyone to be on medication for it. And again, that's also, sometimes people think if I have ADHD, I have to have medicine. That's not a requirement. I think a lot of times, I think it's very helpful, in terms of, especially with the focus and the impulse control. But one of the areas that really doesn't really help as much, that people don't realize, is with executive functioning. So it may help with using, with being more focused to, let's say, be better organized, but it's not going to magically give you the organizational skills. And so that's one of the things where a lot of times when kids get a diagnosis really young, parents, put them on medicine, but don't really do much in the way of any behavioral supports in terms of therapy or executive function or ADHD coaching. And so the problem is then they may be better focused, but they don't actually have the underlying skill sets needed, as the demands increase in school and in life.
Yeah, I feel like that's really the common misconception here that keeps a lot of parents hesitant with getting this diagnosis and going down treatment for it, because I think a lot of people have the misconception that treatment is just the medication. And I don't want to put my 7-year-old on medication. And I do agree with you in what you're saying of it can be beneficial for a lot, but I don't think that that's the only piece. I think that that's a very, very small piece of the puzzle. And then the real core work goes into a lot of this behavioral modification and exercises that we can teach our kids.
Right. And so there's obviously the formal treatment piece in terms of behavioral therapy or some sort of coaching, but also, determining what are you getting out of any sports that you're doing. Because, one of the things with, therapy, for example, is that, while there also part of it is also sometimes addressing the stuff, like maybe it's not the core ADHD symptoms, but the other stuff that's impacted, like self-esteem or other things depending on the circumstance, or anxiety or other related, so that's also an important part of therapy. But sometimes, if someone's, let's say, doing some sort of treatment, they don't feel like they're actually getting at the core symptoms. That's where, re-examining, who are they working with? Are they working with someone that can actually address the direct symptoms? Do they need more of a coach based on what they're looking for? Just because there can be a difference in terms of what someone can address in terms of, working on direct self-regulation skills or planning out homework assignments. And so I think just understanding, like, what are you trying to get out of whatever supports you have, and where are you falling short?
So what is executive dysfunction, and what causes that?
Sure. So it's interesting. So it's a term that's used sometimes. It's not a formal diagnosis. It's not a medical diagnosis. It's a term that's basically used to say that someone has a hard time with executive function skills. And executive function skills are, let's think about a car factory. So a car factory, they have a control room, and the control room manages let's say robots that put together the different pieces of the car to create the final product. Essentially, executive function skills are kind of like the control center of a human brain that basically allows you to plan, organize, get stuff done. Pretty much without executive function skills, you pretty much wouldn't be able to do anything. You wouldn't be able to plan out, how do I get food? How do I get from point A to point B? And so you really need those planning, organizing, getting yourself going skills. And the idea is, in theory, over time, people learn them as they get older, with the parents or caregivers, doing more scaffolding. So, giving more assistance when they're younger, and then gradually kind of pulling back on that to give them more independence as they learn how to do it themselves. The hard part is for people that don't really learn how to do it themselves and have a hard time, executing strategies that maybe they've been given. That's where it can cause issues. So really, I mean, almost anyone, but basically the idea is people can have executive function issues due to a lot of things. So ADHD, I mean, the way that I view the definition of ADHD, I think I would view it as, by default, if you have ADHD, because of the symptoms that the core symptoms of ADHD, you sort of by default have executive function weaknesses. But people can certainly have executive function weaknesses, or what you mentioned as executive dysfunction, without having ADHD. Anxiety can cause that, because if you're really anxious, you may have a hard time getting started and stuff, or you're so anxious you can't think straight, so you can't plan effectively. Depression can do the same type of thing in a slightly different way, or OCD. I mean, I feel like I've sometimes joked that find any sort of disorder that doesn't impact executive functioning, because almost everything that could happen really can impact someone's executive functioning.
So how does an evaluator kind of sort through the differences of like dyslexia or different learning disorders or anxiety conditions and separate that from what could be going on with ADHD? Because we're kind of experiencing this now with getting our 8-year-old evaluated, and they are, coming back with some of their initial evaluations saying that, she's not really showing up on paper as that. We can see it, kind of sitting with her one-on-one in behavioral settings, but on paper, she's kind of got an IQ that's above what could be for ADHD. And, and I think a lot of people get misdiagnosed with ADHD in this evaluation process, or get it later in life because maybe they didn't get it earlier on when they were testing through that. So what are the things that they look for, and how do they separate some of these other disorders that are going on?
Sure. I mean, one thing I do just want to clarify, you mentioned about the IQ. There's not really anything, nothing that says someone can't have a really high IQ and still have ADHD. There's no, I mean, the way the IQ tests work, there's nothing connected to it that says, if your IQ is under this amount in general, you can have ADHD or can't. Like, there are definitely people I've seen that have, extremely high IQs that have ADHD.
Do you find that those people are diagnosed later or have trouble getting a diagnosis, if that's the case?
I think it can be hard. I think it'd be hard. So I think it'd be harder to sort of determine if there's ADHD present, because of the fact that when someone's really bright, I think sometimes they can sort of compensate more effectively, at least for a period of time. So sometimes it's harder to, because even like I've seen on like continuous performance tests, which look at how well someone can stay focused. The people that are extremely bright, even if like in real life they have a hard time focusing, it's often going to show up to some degree on those tests. But I find just anecdotally, they don't always show up as well as you might expect, if someone's able to compensate well. But the idea also is when you look at sort of everything you want to, I mean, that's also why like a comprehensive evaluation is often really important, because it allows you to kind of get a complete picture. So it gives you a sense of what are someone's verbal abilities, how quickly can they do things, looking at their memory skills. Because if you think about it, if someone can't focus, that's going to impact their memory. But also looking at different approaches. So looking at differences between auditory memory and visual memory. And then even with attention, looking at differences between, how well someone can pay attention if they're hearing stuff versus seeing things. Because most measures that you use, even if they're trying to focus on one skill set, often rely on at least some semi-informal evaluation of a second one, just or more, just because it's hard to sort of truly isolate any sort of measure to one skill set. But that's also why looking at things in different, like, so for example, like when I do testing, and I'm, looking at, certainly if I'm looking at if there's a possible learning issue, when I look at reading comprehension, I look at differences between having them answer questions that I read out loud and require an open-ended response versus ones that they read the questions themselves and are multiple choice. Because, there's it could be that they could understand stuff well, but if they have an underlying, like a language issue with expressive language, they may have a hard time actually articulating an answer, even if they actually know the information. Whereas in that case, multiple choice, they may do far better. So that's where there's like a lot of nuances involved in terms of kind of looking at all the pieces together with the testing. And that's where you take all these different, in the same way where, like, if someone has a bad day and they really are unfocused, or they're really tired, they may do poorly on a certain measure, but you assess them another day, they may do far better. So that's also why you don't want to base all of your sort of evaluation off of one thing.
It sounds to me like environment plays a part in this. When parents come to you and they've had their kiddo at home and at school, and they present what it looks like at home for the kiddo and what the school says it looks like for the kiddo when he's at school or she's at school. What are some of the differences that you've seen?
I think it varies. There's some kids where they look pretty similar in both contexts or situations. There's others where, I mean, the report of the parents and the teachers are completely different, and you kind of wonder, are they talking about the same kid?
Do you have an understanding of what's that attributed to? Is it just because of the different, like, I guess, demands that we place on our kids when they're in one environment and when they're in another? Or?
So, I mean, in some cases, they're different factors. So, in some cases, it could be certainly that someone may function very differently in one environment versus another. Some of it could also be that if a child really isn't causing or displaying behavioral issues and isn't disruptive in class, and the teacher has 30 other students, certain things may not be as noticeable. So with ADHD, especially for the inattentive parts of it, it may be that someone's really unfocused, but if it's a big class, the teachers don't realize it. Or if a kid's fidgeting, if the kid's not sitting in the front of the room or the teacher has a lot else going on, they may not really notice. But if the kid is bouncing off the walls and constantly getting up, probably the teacher's going to notice and complain to the parents.
Is there a difference in how ADHD expresses itself between our sons and our daughters?
I mean, I think anecdotally, I would say probably. I mean, certainly they're both. Boys and girls can certainly have either inattentive or combined presentation. In terms of the more primarily inattentive piece, or more of sort of bouncing off the walls. But I think stereotypically, there's probably you often probably see somewhat more in the way of sort of boys that have more of the combined presentation where they're kind of bouncing off the walls, where they're fidgeting, and for girls, there's certainly a high frequency of kind of the sort of excessive talking and really sort of distracted and inattentive, but not as much of the like the physical kind of bouncing off the walls. I mean, certainly I've definitely evaluated women and girls that are in that situation, but I think that's like one not entirely consistent, but one sort of maybe the stereotype that probably has some validity in a decent amount of cases.
I've read along my research that girls are diagnosed a lot less than boys are. Is that something that you've kind of found in your experience?
It's hard to say. I mean, so part of it is in general, when the focus of ADHD is on the inattentive type, I think oftentimes people get diagnosed later, and I think the diagnosis gets missed more. So if you have more girls where it's the inattentive type, it's not something people are necessarily focused on as much, and so certainly it could be missed, or it could be chalked up to them just being really social, because again, another stereotype is sometimes is that girls may be more talkative and chatty than boys. I mean, it's definitely not always true, but sometimes like things that may be attributed, oh, that's just a person being, or the same way with a boy, oh, they're just really just rambunctious. Sometimes people attribute sort of things to one gender or another that just maybe is an accentuated form of what might be considered sort of a stereotype, but then it still ends up being sort of, and then you sort of miss the actual diagnosis because of it.
Yeah. So we've got the diagnosis now. We've talked about the medicine and the behavior therapy. What does behavioral therapy look like? Is there some tools that you can give us or our listeners, some things that we can maybe take away from this and practice at home to kind of organize some structure or help with the regulation?
Sure. I mean, again, it depends what you're trying to target, but certainly there's a lot of things as a starting point that are probably helpful for everyone or most people, but that, are probably even, especially helpful for with ADHD. So, for example, getting enough sleep, having consistency in routines. I mean, a lot of kids and, a lot of people with ADHD in general thrive on routines because it can be hard sometimes to get into develop something into a routine. But I think if you can sort of maintain the consistency as the parent to be able to do that for a kid, then that can definitely help a lot. But also getting their buy-in. So, for example, if you're going to set up, let's say, a morning routine or an evening routine, sit down with your kid together, identify what are the things that we need to do. And you could, I mean, my suggestion on this would be to even like sit down together and write it out in some way. Because if you write down, like, these are the things I need to do from the time I get up until I go to school. So I get up, I go to the bathroom, I get dressed, I brush my teeth, I eat breakfast, make sure my backpack is packed up. Put on my shoes, But then the other piece of it is, so you look at all those different parts, but then maybe estimate completion times. And adults can do this too. If you write down all the things you have to do in the morning from the time you get up until you go off to school or work, and estimate how long it's going to take, that gives you a rough sense of how long you need in the morning. But if you find that the time that you have allotted currently doesn't actually match what you have to do, then it means you either have to free up more time in the morning, in this example, or cut down on what you're doing in the morning and do more at night if you can.
Yeah, that structure I think is really important, and the implementing of that. We have a blackboard on our pantry here in the kitchen, and it's got every hour knocked out of what we should be doing in the day, and where we should be, and how to get there, and how many minutes we have to that. And I think that might also be more for me, because I tell you, as an adult with ADHD, trying to create structure and implement that for a kid with ADHD can be a challenge. So I think.
Right, and you also have to be realistic and there's this, something that's really helpful when you're thinking about, if your child is receiving treatment and the provider is making these suggestions. If you don't feel like you can follow through on what they want you to do, be vocal, tell them that, because it's not going to be helpful if you nod and say, "Oh, we'll do that," and then you just know you can't follow through on it. Because asking them for help and how do I sit down and do this, or if a certain strategy really is not something feasible for you to do, figure out a different approach to it.
One thing that we had talked about in just a previous episode was expectations with vacation. I dare I suggest the idea of also make sure to have fun, make sure to enjoy the process, not just make it all regimented where the kids are like not even the whole thing looks daunting to them just simply because they haven't seen the fun that's in that. So yeah, giving that flexibility, I think, is of utmost importance too.
Yeah, but I do feel like it is that important, because what we're talking about here is where I see it express itself most in our kids is the transitions, like JJ was talking about, when it's all of a sudden a curveball is thrown and we're transitioning from this to that, and they don't have a warning or an idea of how that's structured, is when we get the emotional outbursts in our house.
Right. And again, you can't plan for everything. And so I think having the structure is definitely important, but at the same time, it's also good to have opportunities to practice having to deviate from that structure. Because on the one hand, if a kid or an adult relies too much on that structure, that they become more inflexible when things pop up that get in the way of that structure. I sort of have kind of that balance with it.
I have my son goes to a school that's a public charter school, and parents are expected to perform some sort of assistant teaching every week in the classroom. So I have the luxury of being in the classroom with the kids and stuff. And one of the things that is always up on the marker board at the front of the room is every single block of time in the day. Here's recess, here's bathroom breaks, here's math and stuff, and they have a little hand magnet that points to the next block. And that's something that my son has actually referred back to. And especially like when I had a field trip with the kids last week and we got back to the school, our day was a little bit off, and we talked about, okay, I'm coming back for math. That's normally at this time, and he's pointing to that. So the amount of structure that he receives at school is of massive benefit to him, to which sometimes, honestly, as a parent, kind of feel a little guilty that I have not stuck to enough of a schedule, because when we do not have a certain specific thing that we're looking forward to next, there's a little bit more chaos that tends to try and inject itself into our everyday.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, to a point that you brought up is thinking about sort of at your son's age, sort of what the school does. In a lot of ways, like those types of skill, having the visual schedule are really there to help kids learn how to kind of keep track of their own schedule. And sometimes using that same stuff, even as an adult, can be really helpful. And so I think just, thinking about, or figure out like what works well for your child at school and how can you translate some of that stuff to things at home. So like visual schedules can be really great, having a whiteboard where you have each child's schedule, in the kitchen, somewhere they can see it. But also like one of the really great ways also to help, even if you have your own challenges with it too, is to sort of in a subtle way demonstrate to your children like what you use to keep track of stuff yourself. So for example, if you set reminders in Amazon Echo for certain things, make a point to them if they ask for something that you need to do, say, oh, I'm going to set this reminder now so I can remember it. because that in a lot of ways, without sort of being sort of pushy about it, you're essentially, kind of signaling to your kids, this is something that could be helpful. And then it kind of gently encourages them to use some of these strategies themselves, or even having a shared calendar.
Yeah.
And depending on like, and also if for kids, if they're already on an electronic device like an iPad or computer for certain things, getting them in the habit of using an electronic calendar or a task list or things like that. And for those, you can often print them out, so they don't actually have to be on device all the time to use it. Can be a great way to kind of start some of this stuff at a young age to make it easier as they get older.
Yeah, and I think when our kids do it for themselves, it's way more impactful than us trying to do it as the parents, right? Because I get a lot of pushback of, this is just another thing that Coley's trying to tell me, stepdad's trying to get me to do. But when I can get them to practice the implementation of it and exercise it every day and put the things into their phone, because we just got a Bark phone that's very limited. I don't know if you know about Bark, but it's only for phone calls and text messages and alerts and stuff. And so she's really, mastering that and grabbing some autonomy over that and learning how to do that, and is really excited about that. So putting it up on a board and making her look at it, every day is one thing, but having her set the schedule up and implement it herself, I think, is way more valuable as she grows and learns and progresses in life.
Right, exactly. I mean, but also the idea of, if you think about it like working backwards. So what is the problem or issue you're trying to address? So let's say it's getting ready in the morning on time. Work backwards and collaboratively work with your child or teen to figure out, like, why are you not getting, like, what's causing the issue with getting ready on time? And what can we do to make it better? And then iron out get their input on it. So rather than you dictating this is what you need to do, get them to think for themselves. Because, I think that will long-term help them the most. And they're also be more likely to buy into whatever plan that's set up, because they've had ownership as opposed to being forced on them.
Yeah, and I think you guys are bringing up a good point, Colton. Like you mentioned, your diagnosis more recently, and then working with our kids to create some sort of structure. And then I mentioned, the injection of chaos always tries to find itself in the lack of structure. So if you are an adult who maybe didn't have that sort of formal structure put in place as you were growing up, specifically at home, of course, what might you work with an adult on for efficient processes and time management? Like, what does an example look like?
Sure. I mean, and again, everyone's different in what works for them. But, probably, some form of an online calendar and electronic task list would be sort of two very big sort of go-to things. Because the benefit of a task list for keeping track of stuff is that if you have something you need to complete and you put on a calendar, if you forget to complete it and the day goes by, unless you go back and look at your calendar in prior days, that task is completely gone. But with a task list, it always pops up as overdue and will keep showing up until you mark it off as complete. So it can sort of be a good way of keeping track of stuff, and I think in a better way than just a calendar. But at the same time, you also have to think about the planning. So it's great to have stuff in a task list, but if you have no sense of when you're actually free to do this stuff and there's nothing assigned to it, then you're missing a step. So so I would say with a task list, what can be really helpful is to estimate completion times for tasks in there, and to allot times in a calendar in some way to actually do those tasks. And a lot of programs you can connect to a calendar also, so we can sort of see everything in one place.
Boy, you're just telling me that I've got a lot of books that I need to get on organization and structure, and I'm going to have to watch a lot of Marie Kondo or whatever her name is, because in my brain, it feels like I'm in one of those cash machines that's blowing around cash everywhere, and those are my ideas, and I'm just using my hands to try to grab it all, So, I guess that's my route of treatment, here later in my life. Like we were talking about earlier, I felt I was lost and didn't know where to go. I need to get a whole bunch of organization and structure books and figure out how to organize minute by minute my day.
Yeah, but I think all that's important, but I think I would also be careful not overdoing it on the research either. Because, if you look at all the different options, probably the underlying structure of what is being suggested is pretty similar. There may be lots of different sort of options around, different types of calendar programs or task lists and things like that. But I think, thinking about, like, generally simpler is better. Yeah. The idea of not overdoing it. So figuring out with, let's say, a calendar task list, the idea of, do you want something electronic? Do you want something that's physical? Is it helpful to have, maybe the master list electronic if it's more long term, but that maybe you want something visual for the day-to-day stuff if that's easier to see. But to think about a couple of kind of key pieces of it, and then use that to then from there figure out what kind of program you want to do and to work on setting it up. Or that's also where, a professional can also be really helpful, because there are times where, no matter how great a book is not written for one specific person, and someone's needs may not necessarily match up with whatever's being suggested in a book.
Sure.
Or even if it's there, often the follow through is harder. So having that accountability with someone that can sort of make sure whatever your system you're setting up is a good fit to begin with, and then helping with the accountability to develop into routine can also often be very useful.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that that's really kind of the challenge and also the beauty of this kind of process is, I think that every family is different, every child is different, every parenting tactic is different, and this really takes, like, how can we take these simple tactics and implement it in our family in a way that resonates or that sticks with our kids here. And I think that that's different for everybody. Just because one thing works for one family or one kid, doesn't mean that it'll work exactly for you, though the simple kind of basic understanding of what you need to do is there. But I think that it may need to be changed a little bit depending on what your kid responds to and what he likes and what he doesn't and what his triggers are. So I think it's really takes a lot of openness, and I think that that's challenging for a lot of people, but I think that that's also really beautiful that we can create something in our own family dynamic that is unique and special to us and how we operate.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think you made a really good point about the individual nature of it and how each person is different. So it really, if you look at all different pieces you put together to create sort of a comprehensive system, it may look very different from one family to the next.
I think one thing that I pulled apart from this is that, while everybody's unique and different and might need their own sort of process to get through to achieve what success looks like for them, I imagine the relationships that they have are impacted only in a positive way as a result of coming up with a time management and, efficient process and, getting things done and having a little bit of structure in life. Is that something that, kind of you move into? This might be a far-reaching question, but something you move into once you've created some sort of time management structure and whatnot, the emotional impact that anxiety and ADHD and self-esteem can have on one. Is there something that you see like a correlation between the two, and then you work on maybe that next step?
Yeah, well, there's definitely a connection to it, and I think that on some level, getting a system in place, and one that you're able to follow through on and use can help sometimes offset some of those negative feelings, and because then it becomes more of a positive mindset that you can sort of see going forward in a positive way with sort of being on top of stuff and being better organized. And there's certainly those thoughts may pop up still and those worries, and it's important to sort of process those as well. But I think when you're sort of going in a direction that you feel comfortable and are happy about, that can sometimes make things better. Whereas if you feel like you keep trying the same thing over and over again and you're not getting a different result, that can be very discouraging.
Yeah, I think that that's why anxiety is connected a lot to ADHD is if we're not given the right tools or the right information to understand this, that's really overwhelming, right? And nothing seems to be kind of going right with trying to organize the executive function, especially if you have parents that are, have the mindset of just go get your energy out over there and I don't want to deal with it. That can make a kid feel very anxious, right? So I think, like you're saying, with the behavior modification and the therapy and the open communication with the parents and the parents' willingness to, go out there and be open to these resources, I feel like can really help alleviate a lot of the anxiety, because I feel like maybe that's where a lot of my anxiety came up in my life too. And, along with my ADHD diagnosis, I also was diagnosed with generalized anxiety. And again, I think maybe we could have helped one of those symptoms if we were a little bit more proactive in this condition and the treatment and information surrounding it. So I do have one more question too before we kind of wrap things up. I know your time is very valuable and you've got to get going, but I do want to kind of ask one more piece to that. And we've talked about some kind of preemptive behavioral things that we can implement, but what are some things that we can do, or some great questions that we can ask when our kids are going through an emotional outburst in the moment? They've got themselves worked up over some, homework or whatever it is, and they're in dysregulation. How can we help our kids calm down, or what are questions that we can help ask them or ourselves to
Sure.
de-escalate this situation?
Sure. I mean, so I think especially for younger kids, helping them to identify what are they. I mean, this work with adults too, or older kids, is to help them identify first so if they're starting to get upset, what emotion are they experiencing? So, and if you need to prompt them, are you feeling angry? Are you feeling frustrated? Are you feeling sad? Because a lot of times when people get sort of really worked up, it's hard for them to think about what they're actually feeling. They just sort of feel, like there's something negative going on. But sometimes by like making it tangible, so being able to like basically label the emotion first, and then try to identify, it's almost like fill in the blank of, I feel, let's say, frustrated because X, Y, or Z, because let's say his homework assignment is hard. Even though in theory that may seem like a really simple thing to identify, in the moment for the child or teen, it may be really hard, even adults too. It can sometimes be hard in the moment to sort of articulate that or but if they can sort of hear that back to them, sometimes that can diffuse the situation, because then it becomes more concrete. Because if you identify what the problem is, the issue is in a concrete way, then you can also potentially identify what is the solution. So if they're feeling frustrated because the assignment is hard, then maybe a tangible solution would be to potentially, one, take a break and come back to it in a few minutes when they've had sort of fresh mindset to it. Maybe two would be to, can we work on it together and look at what about it is difficult? Is it that you don't understand the question? Is it that you just aren't sure how to articulate what you want to say? Let's say it's an essay or something. Because then sort of you turn sort of what can be challenging into something very concrete, and you can create tangible solutions that then are easier to follow through on than this like just sort of essentially cloud of the unknown of what's going on.
Got on mute, Colton.
Yep. Sorry, guys. Yeah, I think that's the trap that we fall into as parents a lot of times is, I just dealt with this the other night in this kind of mindset. We had a 2-hour meltdown at our house over at dinner because our oldest wanted a second helping of pasta and wanted to add extra salt on it. And we said, no, there's already been seasons, and she couldn't handle that no salt on the pasta. And it became this big meltdown into this, I'm going to call the cops on mommy and have her arrested for child abuse because you're not allowed to starve your children. And I didn't have an explosive moment, but in my brain, I was really fighting this moment of like, it's just fucking salt and pasta. Like, what are we doing here? And we stayed calm and talked our daughter through that rather than yelling or raising our voices, which I was very proud of both my wife and I for doing that. But I was at the end of that very frustrated with like, how could an evening about salt transgress into this conversation about child abuse with our 8-year-old, and how we had to convince her that, well, what happens if mama goes to jail? Who's going to cook for you? Who's going to take for you? Who's going to do that? We had to ask all these questions to go down this rabbit hole of where her brain was taking this, and, my wife and I were kind of having this after action review after that and talking about it. And as parents, and, I was vocalizing, I just don't understand it. And, my wife had that same kind of viewpoint of view as, it seems so small to us, but to her, it's just this world-ending thing. She just needs this autonomy, this control over something in her life, and we're not letting her have it. And it just feels crushing, which we can feel that as adults, right? When your boss isn't listening to you, your spouse isn't reciprocating some of the things that you're trying to communicate. Those things can feel really overwhelming. Now try bringing your head back into that of an 8-year-old, and though we can dissect and separate as adults, our little ones can't. And I think we can be so much powerful as parents in showing up in a way that's more meaningful if we can kind of reset and set our thought process into what that overwhelming feeling could be for our 8-year-old, rather than us looking at it as the dad going, it's just salt.
Right. And I think showing empathy in the moment to that, rather than sort of the kind of almost like the opposition, sort of can sometimes help to some degree, even if you obviously enforce sort of there's no salt on the pasta, but just the idea of like showing that sort of understanding, even if you disagree and won't sort of give in, can sometimes go a long way to view the situation also.
Yeah, we had to talk with our therapist about that, and, kind of came to the conclusion of, is salt that important? If you see that this is a trigger for your 8-year-old and that this is going to be this emotional thing that's going to take you on a 2-hour journey, maybe it's okay sometimes as parents to say, you know what, okay, you can have the salts. I was wrong, or I
Right. It's
changed
also
my
important, yeah,
mind.
to pick your battles.
Exactly. And I think we do get caught up in a lot of that as adults, as parents of, I want my way and I'm the boss and I have to put my foot down and you have to do what I say, where this is a compromising reciprocal relationship where our little ones are humans and they have these really big emotions and thoughts that we need to be respectful of.
Well, this has been a great talk, Dr. Heller. We really appreciate your time. And is there anything that you would like to kind of share with our listeners before we wrap this up? Any resources that you'd like to point them to? Because I know that this discussion is just kind of like a starting point for a number of listeners, and could use some additional guidance and resources as they figure out their own journey.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm happy. I mean, one really great resource for everything ADHD is CHAD. It's a national nonprofit organization that focuses a lot on children and adults with ADHD. So I think it's just chad.org is the website. They have all sorts of toolkits and things like that. That would be a great resource. My website, Heller Psychology Group. If you go under there's a resource page that has a bunch of articles and other things that may be helpful around ADHD also.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Heller. This has really been a great conversation. I've learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot. I can't thank you again for coming on and doing this with us. You're a great man and you're doing great work, and I appreciate everything that you do. So thank you once again, and thank you, listeners. Don't worry, we'll have all those links in the show notes for you, and some info about Dr. Heller here, not Dr. Keller. But thank you once again for listening, everybody, and thank you for supporting and subscribe, comment, and all that jazz. And I'm your host, CJ.
I'm JJ.
And this has been Dr. Heller on our episode on ADHD. So thank you guys, and until next time.